right, we're in 2 Kings 23. Picking up about verse 11. So we're in the middle of Josiah's reform, which is very thorough. He's concerned with not only ridding idolatry from the land, but also making it in such a way that he ruins the places where they practice idolatry by defiling them. He will burn bones on their sacred places so that they will no longer be used again as sacred places. And so he's in the midst of that process, where we pick up in verse 11. It says, "And he removed the horses that the kings of Judah had dedicated to the sun at the entrance of the house of the Lord by the chamber of Nathan-Melech, the chamberlain of which was in the precincts. And he burned the chariots of the sun with fire." And so obviously he's just continuing on with what he's already done, throwing things away, throwing things out of the temple, tearing down apartments that were attached to the temple that shouldn't have been there. And in verse 12 it says, "On the altars of the roof of the upper chamber of Ahaz, which the kings of Judah had made, and the altars that Manasseh, who was his grandfather, had made in the two courts of the house of the Lord, he pulled down and broke in pieces and cast the dust into the brook Kidron. And the king defiled the high places that were east of Jerusalem to the south of the Mount of Corruption." The Mount of Corruption there is a reference to the Mount of Olives, or Olivet, which Solomon the king of Israel had built for Ashtaroth, the abomination of the Sidonians, and Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. That's 1 Kings 11, 5 through 7. Solomon started that particular apostasy. And then in 14 it says, "And he broke in pieces the pillars and cut down the Asherim," who of course was a female deity, "and filled their places with the bones of men." And so he's tearing away every semblance that was there. We talked about a couple of weeks ago the radical nature of the reform, but there are some things that the only way to answer them is radical action. You can't coax it out. You can't sweet talk it out. It's just got to be cut out. And, we understand that with a lot of areas in our lives, especially with our health. We understand that surgery is necessary if there's something that's threatening our lives. We do take drastic measures. Any way you want to cut it, surgery is a drastic measure when you're cutting open your body and doing certain things. And we do that with our physical bodies. But spiritually speaking, there are matters that are just as serious that have to be attacked with the same type of tenacity that we would health issues. And so that's what he's doing here, is he's cleansing the temple and defiling and trying to rid idolatry during his day. Now remember, we said that he's doing this after he has already been told it doesn't really matter. I mean, they're going to go back into idolatry, and they're going to go into captivity. And so what Josiah is doing, he's not serving God out of some notion that he's going to earn a reward, but because he knows it to be the right thing. Is what God wants, and he wants God to be honored. And so he goes through this process. Now what's interesting is, what we're going to see now is that he turns his attention to Bethel, which belonged to the 10 northern tribes. It didn't even belong to him. It's not even his jurisdiction. But he goes there. So in verse 15 it says, "Moreover, the altar at Bethel," 1 Kings 12, you remember Jeroboam the son of Nebat, he built an altar at Dan and one at Bethel. Dan was the northernmost portion of Israel, and Bethel was the southernmost portion of the 10 northern tribes anyway. He said, "The high place that he was erected by Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin, the altar with the high place, he pulled down and burned, reducing it to dust. He also burned the Asherah." So he's reducing them to dust. Now that is, I think, what the narrator of Kings wants us to see when we read that. He's grinding the idols and their altars into powder and dust. I think what he wants us to remember is what happened with, especially in this context, what happened in the wilderness when Moses was up on the mountain getting the law. In Exodus 32, when they went in and they built a molten calf, very similar to what Jeroboam would build. And you remember that Moses on that occasion not only rebuked them for it, but he ground it into powder and put it into the drinking water and made them drink it. Said, "If you want it, here you go." And so what Josiah is doing here is very similar to that. He is taking what it is that they hold so dear, and he's destroying any remnant of it whatsoever. And so I think when we read what Josiah is doing, the writer wants us to also envision that he's in similar step with what Moses did in a similar situation. And there are a lot of things, especially in the New Testament, that are written that way. Many things in the gospel accounts, the writer is expecting us to be familiar with similar accounts in the Old Testament and helping us to understand those things in Jesus as the greater and better Moses. So here it's Josiah. He burns it, he reduces it to dust. Verse 16, and Josiah turned, and he saw the tombs there on the mount. And he sent and took the bones out of the tombs and burned them on the altar and defiled it. And again, the word of the Lord, according to the word of the Lord that the man of God proclaimed, who had predicted these things. Okay? Now that has reference to 1 Kings chapter 13. That's a long time ago. 1 Kings chapter 13, right after he finished setting up these golden calves, you remember the unnamed young prophet who had an older prophet lie to him, and he was ended up being killed by a lion. He predicted in 1 Kings 13:2 that a king named Josiah would tear this down and burn it down. Well, he's doing it now. And one of the things that shows us is that was early on in the history of Israel. I mean, that's 900s. It's now later 600s. So we're talking 200 and 300 years later. It's just now happening. When God says something, it is as certain to be done as if he spoke it yesterday. Okay? That's what in 2 Peter chapter 3, the text when he says 1,000 years is as one day, and a day with the Lord is as 1,000 years. He's not telling us that's how God computes time somehow. What he's saying is, if it takes 1,000 years, if God makes a prediction at 1,000 years, it's just as sure as if he made the prediction yesterday, and it's coming true today. That's how sure it will be. 1,000 years from now, but it's just as sure as if he made it yesterday and he's fulfilling it today. And so while that may take time, it doesn't mean that it's not coming. And Ecclesiastes, Solomon addresses the attitude that a lot of people have toward that when he says that because sentence is not executed against a sinner immediately, the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. That is, the person reasons in their mind, well, God hasn't punished me yet, so apparently he's not going to. I mean, I think we've talked about that. That's pretty nuts. Okay? I mean, you can jump off a building of 100 stories. You can be 50 stories down and be like, I got this. If it was going to happen to me, if I was going to die, I'd already be dead. Just wait 50 more stories and you'll find out how wrong that is. Right? So that type of thinking is not, it's just not smart. And so here we see it. He predicted it, and now it is coming. Then he said in verse 17, then he said, what is this monument that I see? And the men of the city told him, it's the tomb of the man of God who came from Judah and predicted these things that you have done against the altar of Bethel, talking about that tomb of the young prophet, in 1 Kings 13. And he said, let him be, let no one move his bones. So they let his bones alone, with the bones of the prophet who came out of Samaria, that is the older prophet who was also buried in that same place. And then verse 19, it says, and Josiah removed all the shrines also of the high places that were in the cities of Samaria. That's the capital city of the northern tribes, which has been in captivity now for several years. And it's being inhabited by other people with Assyria. So by doing this, he makes himself vulnerable to Assyria, because he's going into technically Assyrian-owned territory and tearing down idols that are there, that they had invested time and money in, saying, you remember at the end of 2 Kings 17, they had priests come and help the people of the land try and understand the customs of calf worship and of the Lord. And so now he's going into that land and he's cleansing it, even in jurisdiction that's not its own. And the point that he's trying to make is that I'm cleansing all of Israel. I'm wiping it clean. I want every bit of it gone. This land belongs to God. It belongs to his people, and God deserves to be honored in every square inch of it. And so he's entering into Samaria to do that. It says, he did to them according to all that he had done at Bethel. And he sacrificed all the priests of the high places who were made there on the altars and burned human bones on them. And then he returned to Jerusalem. So the burning of human bones, defiling or desecrating. So the common idea then was that if you burned human bones on something, you desecrated it. Okay? It was considered, for lack of a better term, kind of taboo. Just a place you didn't go back again. And so by doing that, he's discouraging the repetitive behavior. And this, what sets him apart is that other kings would be like David. They would choose not to be idolaters, but sometimes they wouldn't remove the high places. Others would remove the high places, but apparently when they removed them, they just kind of set the stuff aside in another room, and when time came and they died, they went and pulled all the stuff back out. And Josiah said, nope, we're going to do spring cleaning. This stuff is going everywhere, okay? If they go back into idolatry, it's going to have to be because they took the time, they invested the money, and they went and they rebuilt everything. It's not going to be because I left them a chance to make the same mistake again. Okay? So, that's his reform. Then he moves them in this next section of 21 to 27 or at least 21 to 25, in the practice of Passover. Now, what was Passover to them? What did it commemorate? Kind of in the name. Okay? Being released from Egypt, when God literally passed over the homes of the firstborn where the blood was. And so it goes back to the time of their redemption when God saved them and made them his people. Okay? Now, here's the thing. It was one of the three major feast days that all male Jews were required to be in Jerusalem, Deuteronomy 16, Leviticus 23. So when we're restoring something, you have to take people back to the very foundation and heart. Listen, Josiah could have just said, I'm going to tear all the idols down, I'm going to burn them, I'm going to desecrate everything, and then we're good. But there's really been no heart change in the people, right? All he did was took their stuff away. He didn't change their heart. So what do you have to do in those situations? You got to take them back and show them their beginning. I had a teacher that was of the judgment, and I think the longer I do it and the older I get, the more I think he's right. He said, when it comes to restoring people who have left the church, he's like, I'm not anti-sending cards, I'm not anti-reaching out, I'm not anti any of those things. He said, but really what has happened is something has gone wrong. And what they need is a Bible study. What they need is to sit down and learn and be reminded anew of what it is God has really done for them. Because the root of all apostasy is forgetting what God has done for us. And ceasing, as Paul would put it in Romans 1, to be thankful for what God has done for us. That's what leads us to apostasy. And so bringing them down to that moment. So for us as Christians, it would be taking people to the cross and reminding ourselves of what Jesus has done for us. That has a way of basically knocking us to our knees, if not our face, when we go back there. I'm really not as good as I think I am. And I'm actually a lot worse than I think I am. And we need to be reminded of that. Because part of the reason why we walk away is we think, I'm a good person. Yeah, be careful with that thinking. Good in whose definition? And then you look up. It's one thing to say it to another person. I'm a good person. I still pray. I still read my Bible. I still do some of those things. It's another thing to have to look Jesus in the face and say, I'm a good person. I don't care how good I am. I hope I'm not stupid enough to ever do something like that. To look at the sinless Son of God and say, I'm a good person. No. No. Never in a million years. Never. Well, the way the cross works for us is the way that the Exodus worked for them. God brought them from a state of helplessness and He saved them. And that's why I was even reading today an argument for Luke's gospel being a new Exodus, leading out of spiritual captivity and the imagery that he uses. And so he's playing on that idea in Luke's gospel that if you were Israelites and you wanted to restore the people, you had to remind them what God had done for them. That meant you had to go back to Egypt. You had to go back and see what God did for them there. For us, we have to go back to our Exodus. We have to go back to the time when we were set free. We have to go back to Jesus on the cross. And so that's what he's doing here in this Passover. And I know the bell's going to ring in just a second, but it's not a lot of statements, not a lot here. So as far as wording, it says, and the king commanded all the people to keep the Passover of the Lord your God that is written in the book of the covenant. Now listen to what this says. For no such Passover has been kept since the days of the judges who judged Israel, or during the days of the kings of Israel or the kings of Judah. But in the 18th year of King Josiah, the Passover was kept to the Lord in Jerusalem. Nobody ever kept it the way they did that time. They had fewer resources, and in their minds, they had fewer reasons to be thankful. It was in their mind now. It wasn't like when Solomon dedicates the temple and we think, yeah, everything's great. The city is secure. David made sure that happened. Solomon has got us to the top of the world empires. I mean, we're bottom feeders now. And now they're learning to keep the Passover in a way that they've never done it. And that's why he says this about him in 24. He says, moreover, Josiah put away all the mediums and the necromancers, which are people who supposedly communicate with the dead, and the household gods and the idols and the abominations that were in the land of Judah and in Jerusalem, that he might establish the words of the law written in the book that Hilkiah the priest found in the house of the Lord. Before him there was no king like him, who turned to the Lord with all of his heart and with all of his soul and with all of his might, according to the law of Moses, nor did any like him arise after him. Listen to those 3 points again. Who turned to the Lord with all of his heart, with all of his soul, and with all of his might. What does that remind you of? Greatest commandment. Deuteronomy 6:4-5. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, and with all of your soul, and with all of your might. Here we have one of the few occasions in Scripture where God, commenting on a man's life, says, he loved me with everything he had. You know, like Miles said tonight, what really matters doesn't matter what anybody else says at the end of the day, but what God pronounces on our lives. And can you imagine what it would feel like to have God look at your life and say, he loves me with everything that's in him. She loves me with everything that's in her. I know it. That's why Josiah is my favorite king, and I think he's the best king that ever reigned in Israel. But we'll pick up in 26, hopefully next week, and then move into the decline. It won't be very long from this point forward.